Okay, and I think we can get started now. Good day, everyone. Thanks for coming. Big welcome to all of you gathered here, and also a big welcome to all of the people who are watching us on live stream around the world. Welcome, all of you. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor in chief of Foreign Policy Magazine. And I would like to just begin by thanking Doha Forum for bringing us together here in this very august building and room that we've been given. And also thanks to UNOCT, that's the UN's Office of Counterterrorism, which has organized this particular panel and brought us here together. Um, the topic we're here to discuss today is breaking barriers with behavioral science. And this is a very important topic, really. And we're going to focus on counterterrorism, but I just very quickly want to talk about behavioral science. And the reason why it's so important is that, unlike many other sciences that are entirely data driven, behavioral science often gets ignored. So, for example, economists often look at data and they feel frustrated when, for example, there's a lag between economic data and how people feel. So, if the economy is doing well on paper, but people feel like the economy isn't great for them. Why is that the case? Well, that's behavioral science. Behavioral science can explain a whole bunch of things about how people feel. It's a really important thing. It also gets to the root causes of policymaking. And so, in particular, when we're here today to discuss counterterrorism, there's an approach that we often think of about terrorism, which is, essentially whack-a-mole. You see a problem, let's just fight it and fix it, but it doesn't quite fix the root causes of the problem. And that's what we're going to try and get at today. I will try and take a question or two from you in the audience if there's time at the end. But we're quite packed and we have many speakers. So I'm going to very quickly introduce them and then we're going to dive right in. So we have with us here today um, Vladimir Voronkov. You are the Undersecretary General of the UN's Office of Counterterrorism. To his left, Majid Al Ansari. He's an advisor to the Prime Minister of Qatar and also a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have Khalid Koser, the founding executive director of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund. I'm not exactly going in order here, but Rosalind Nyawira here, director of Kenya's National Counterterrorism Center. Thomas Greminger, he's the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, former Swiss diplomat and ambassador, and Iris Lorisi, the president of the Counseling Line for Women and Girls in Albania. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Mr. Voronkov, I'm going to start with you. So you run the UN's Office of Counterterrorism. Um, how important is behavioral science in the way in which you think about combating terrorism around the world? And as you think about that question, how does all of this lead up to contributing to the UN's future summit?
Ravi, thank you very much. It's really very important topic. I would like to start by thanking our Qataris colleague because we are doing this part of work together, behavioral insights and countering radicalization, countering violent extremism. Prevention agenda is of utmost importance in counter-terrorism dimension, and behavioral science, of course, are a part of this prevention agenda. So you know that, of course, this is not a topic only for counterterrorism. This is a wider topic because behavioral science are new technology and innovative technology, and new technologies are designed for good and for bad. And of course, to understand what could be used as a tool to prevent better, it's a topical issue in counterterrorism agenda.
Can you explain for just a quick minute why do you think it's new? I mean, human beings have been around and the science of understanding them is ancient.
But you know, the amount of collected information has changed.
Mm.
The tools how to collect and analyze the information has changed. So it might be a very good future for the humankind if controlled and of course not in contradiction with the human rights.
Mm.
So it's very important topic and I'm very grateful that we have this topic for the discussion today. Of course, United Nations is doing utmost with regard to develop this part of international agenda. The Secretary General is directly engaged in discussions on this very issue. He released a report on behavioral insights and activities of the United Nations. 25 United Nations entities participated in this report. And the main understanding is that, of course, this is a powerful tool for changes for better. And we need to understand how to use this tool effectively. Of course, this topic will be a part of new agenda for peace, will be discussed at the summit of the future, which will be organized by the United Nations in September next year. So I think it's a topic which will influence all parts of the activities of the United Nations. Of course, I'm not the main expert in this very field. It's very specific field. And I think today's discussion could provide us with new understanding, new interests, new arguments in favor of more and more using of this innovation technology. But again, we need to understand how to be in line with and use this technology properly. Because in other case, we could create even more difficulties for us in our counterterrorism activities
Mm.
than to find solutions. So I think today's discussion could contribute to this.
Okay, well, thank you for teeing us up very nicely there, and that's why we're here. Majid Al Ansari, you speak for Qatar. How do you think about this topic and behavioral science and the techniques that we're discussing here? How do you see them as influencing combating radicalism or inequality or extremism?
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be next to all these esteemed colleagues here, but especially USG Ivanka, who I've worked with for many years now, especially on this topic. I had the honor of being on the team when we started exploring the possibility of having a behavioral insight hub here in Doha, and I applaud the work by the UNOCT over this important part of it, and the partnership with Qatar has always been appreciated from our sides for many aspects, but especially for the fact that we need to bring into the consideration, into the discussion, something that is different than what is there right now. Rhetoric and theorizing about radicalization, theorizing about social exclusion, theorizing about all these issues around the world needs to be grounded in data and grounded in in science. And one main way of doing it is through utilizing such a caveat as the behavioral sciences. Behavioral sciences have been utilized for many years now within economy, but more so within the business environment, and has resulted in a lot of developments on that front and making money. But it's time to use these sciences in making peace through through the work that that's is being done here. In Qatar, we have utilized behavioral sciences for many respects, especially with the World Cup that was here. You're talking about the population of Qatar increasing by almost 50% during the World Cup, and therefore the need for behavior, to understanding how people will behave, helped a lot in using these behavioral science
Give us a
insights.
quick example of that.
Yeah, so for example, in crowding people, in making sure that we don't have floods of people coming out and obstructing the entrances, these kinds of understanding how people will move, understanding what might instigate chaos wherever it might be, and even when it comes to developing eco-friendly practices during the World Cup, all of that has been very helpful. In education, we've used it. Simple things like just introducing reminders for students and parents, increase the level of attendance in school and decrease thereby lack of attendance. When it comes to urban planning, for example, and to make sure that it's helpful with social exclusion, we've developed policies using behavioral insight into what how people live within their environment and how that could help us in develop the environment they work in and live in better. And also when it comes to mediation, As you might know, we do a lot of mediations here in Qatar and conflict resolution efforts, and understanding the behavior of those parties of the conflict on the ground and on the negotiation table helps us develop how we write it, and certainly the radicalization of youth and how uh, these groups have been able to use their understanding of behavior and how it's affected to recruit youth into radicalized environments and to radicalized groups.
So, can I ask you just specifically on that, since you bring up mediation, and this, of course, is a topic that everyone here is so interested in? Qatar's played such an important role in mediation recently between Israel and Hamas. And I'm curious how the topic at hand today plays into that, how you are thinking about the behavior of various actors here. And essentially, this is game theory, right?
Yeah.
So, how you deploy that, but also, do you think, uh, in a new sense, is it possible to get these sides back to the table in the coming weeks?
I'm a social scientist by training, and coming to this with an academic background, you always find the importance of using these kind of tools within the process itself. So basically, the process of mediation is getting people to agree on both sides of the table, right? It's not more complicated than that. Certainly, it's more complicated the process itself, but the actual process of getting people to agree has a lot of mind tricks you have to play, have a lot of how to speak to both sides in a way that would affect the way they behave. And to do that, you need to understand the behavior, and this is why the patterns that came through. We've been mediating between Israel and Hamas now since 2006, so we understand the mentality and the drivers of behavior on both sides. And we employ that in all the level of the mediation. It was very helpful, certainly, within this framework. And we are hopeful that post this conflict, we will be able to institutionalize that into a practice through the Behavioral Insight Academy here in Doha and in cooperation with the UNOCT to get this kind of training to people that need it all around the world when it comes to conflict resolution and de-radicalization.
I'm just going to ask you one quick follow up, and then I'm going to bring everyone else in. But, most of the Western world sees Hamas as a terrorist group, of course. And, part of what you're describing with behavioral science is to predict, to understand how groups might act and what their incentive structures are. And of course, before October 7, at least in the West, I would say no one had any sense that this attack was going to take place. No one really knew how Hamas might be thinking about the status quo. Um, Given the shock of October 7, how do you now see Hamas as an actor? I mean, do they strike you as rational actors that respond to game theory in the way you're describing? Or do you see them as actors that can't be reasoned with?
First of all, when you work as a mediator, you don't mediate between sides that you fully agree with. You
Correct.
don't mediate between parties that are at all times savory and politically acceptable around the world. We mediated between Taliban and the United States. We are mediating between Iran and the United States. We're mediating between Russia and Ukraine. So you don't have the luxury as a mediator to to just go around and say whatever you like about both sides of the conflict.
Sure.
And therefore, we always limit ourselves to what we are saying in order not to affect our role as mediator. That said, this didn't happen in a void. The attack of the 7th of October didn't happen in a status quo that was, a peaceful status quo. The the number of people killed in the conflict, 2023, was more than any year for the past decade before the 7th of October. So you said that, and you rightly said that people in the West didn't see this coming. We saw it coming. I remember being on meetings with the prime minister where he was pleading with world leaders, including from the West, that something terrible will happen if this continues. There's a level of escalation, a level of rhetoric in the conflict, and a level of dehumanizing of the Palestinians that will result in something terrible happening in the ground. And this is what happened. Certainly, nobody expected this level of brutality. But what we are seeing right now from the other side, with 17,000 people killed, 7,000 children killed, children's bodies decomposing in hospitals, corpses being eaten by dogs in the streets, are not something that will help de-radicalize the Palestinians or any other people in the region. It will only help those who want to recruit youth into their radical groups
Mm.
to just share these videos and these pictures that are going on. It's not going to make Israel's people safe. It's not going to make Palestinians safe. It's not going to make anybody around the world safe unless we are able to stop this war. And we applaud the work that's been done by the Secretary General of the UN on this. But we need all together to work, and utilizing something like behavioral sciences in understanding what drives people into this kind of behavior is very important, because simply using rhetoric and politicizing these issues will end up with more violence, and it's a cycle that will never stop.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have so many more questions I want to ask you, but I'm going to bring in the others first. Let me jump all the way to the end over there. Roslyn Nyawira, you are from Kenya. Of course, your country is very young, and I believe the median age is around about 20 years. And I'm curious how you think about behavioral science as it applies to young people in terms of being able to ensure that they are resilient, that they aren't radicalized, especially when you include the internet then as well. How do you think, how is Kenya, how are you managing that side of this equation?
Thank thank you very much. Let me first start by appreciating the government of Qatar and the organizers of this event for the invitation and for the hosting. Let me answer your question by first giving an example of how we have seen, for example, the threat of terrorism evolve in our situation. You have this situation where populations within certain segments of society were more vulnerable to radicalization than others. So you have young men coming from a certain region going to the terrorist theaters more than another region. And so you want right there to go and understand why does this community seem to be more vulnerable than the others in the country, that you have talk about tens of youth that want to move. And so we go in there and want to understand their sociology. What is the society? What's the culture? What is the anthropology? How does the environment affect the way they think, the way they react? And what are the other factors, perhaps even within governance, that are making these youth more vulnerable, including the presence of in the spread of technology, because a lot of youth now have access to that. And so we come in and want to understand them and have interventions that don't necessarily pathologize them or push them further to that area, but we want to understand these various things. How come that they are more vulnerable? What is it that is happening to this youth? And so in the interventions that we come up with, you have to be you're sensitive to them. You don't want to make them an exclusive social group. You want to inclusion, but you also want to understand, as you celebrate their diversity, understand what is happening within this community. So those are some of the ways in which we have found behavioral science very useful. And even when they go and they want to come back, what is it then that's pushing them out of the conflict theater for them to want to come back into the country? And how do the interventions then make sure that they don't push them any further, but incorporate them back to society?
Mm. Khalid Koser, let me bring you in. How do communities matter here? One imagines that if you have a strong community with strong ties among people, then it would be less likely to produce radical extremists. How do you ensure that? But also, is that a foolproof kind of system design?
Thanks very much for the invitation and thanks for being part of this wonderful panel. Let me start by saying this, and I think we've heard this from all of the panelists. I believe that the global environment today is more conducive to violent extremism and terrorism than it has been for at least a decade. So I welcome the focus of this panel and I welcome its focus on solutions. The organization that I run, the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, communities, our job is to identify young people at risk of radicalization and recruitment and try to provide better alternatives, build stronger communities, build community resilience. And let me just give you one example of how we are using behavioral science to try to do our work. The bigger picture here, I think there's a risk of overestimating how important behavioral science can be. It seems to me that it's an immensely labor and cost intensive piece of work to be done properly. Secondly, it requires a long-term commitment, and we know that there's not much appetite for long-term commitments amongst our donors at the moment. And thirdly, we know that measuring results is immensely difficult when it comes to behavioral science. But the way that we use behavioral science in the communities that we're working with, and this is across 22 countries, 3 million young people at risk reached, and we're providing support to them, is this. We think we can use behavioral science to accelerate existing approaches. And very specifically, we think you can use behavioral science to increase enrollment, training courses, the sorts of programs that we fund, to increase participation once people are enrolled, and to increase the sustainability of those programs. And let me give you one example, and then I'll hand over the microphone. We're currently launching a program in Al Roj camp in northeast Syria, where we're working with nationals of certain countries who've identified people to return from those camps and want us to provide pre-departure training to those people before they land on the tarmac back in their capitals. This is how we're using behavioral science insights to provide that pre-departure training. Firstly, the importance of active choice. And we all know that in refugee camps, you have very little choice. The way to get people to come to trainings is to give them a choice. You don't have to come if you don't want to. And if you do, there's a variety of options that you can choose from. That's behavioral science. Incentives. How do you use incentives to encourage people who may be nervous, who may not want to be exposed to come to sessions? I think you have to do it carefully. I think there's ethical issues. We've found that providing incentives at the beginning rather than at the end is the way to do it. You're not rewarding people for participating, you're incentivizing them by providing a reward at the outset. We think that's the best way to do it. Framing, again, behavioral science concept, immensely important. You don't frame this as preventing violent extremism. You frame this as an opportunity to go home and reintegrate in your community and make a difference in countries which you're going. Two more, self-reflection. The best way we have found to use behavioral science to engage people once they are enrolled is to give them the opportunity to reflect. It's not just going to a training course. It's saying stop, spend half an hour, take a piece of paper and reflect on what you've learned. That's behaviors. That makes people absorb the lesson. And the final point we have learned that I think is essentially important is the role of the message. People trust messages that are conveyed by a messenger who they trust. And so for this particular piece of work, we are bringing people from the countries to which people are being repatriated so that they can provide the pre-departure training in the camps to their nations. So I think these are examples of how you can use very specific behavioral science insights to accelerate existing programs around building future.
That's a very eloquent answer, but in my mind, it leaves the question of, well, what do you do then about communities and places that have difficult life conditions? Majid Al-Ansari earlier said that we saw it coming about October 7th, for example, not specifically, but in terms of when you have a pressure cooker or you have difficult life conditions, then it can produce adverse outcomes. It can produce adverse responses. And I guess this leaves me a little bit confused, and maybe Majid, I can come to you with this. If you can't fix difficult life conditions, if there are parts of the world that are deeply troubled, are the kinds of places that can produce people who feel like they need to react in a big way, then isn't this discussion moot? I mean, how do you stop that?
The benefit of being the hosts that we get more time than other speakers on this panel. So I apologize to my colleagues here who I'm sure have better things to say than I. But the world we live in is not necessarily a happy world. We see pain everywhere we go. We see societies and communities that our colleague here was stating that are in such a dire situation that there is no hope for the future. And I think that's the key word. It's providing hope to the hopeless. It's being able to tell a child who's growing up in a refugee camp that you have hope in a future where you will have a job, you will have a family, you will be safe, you can dream of a better future. Just the fact of introducing that into a child's mind will reverse a lot of what's happening. The problem now is that we have generation upon generation upon generation of refugees, generation upon generation of people under siege, generation upon generation of people who are living in conflict zones. In Doha, we have the education initiative, which we launched years back that helped now education above all, which helped educate more than 12 million children in conflict zones around the world. These kinds of initiatives need to be systematically introduced to those people who are in need. And this is why we were introducing hope in Gaza through our aid program there. It was finding jobs for youth with more 60% unemployment. It was finding, a hope of a better tomorrow for those who wanted to go to school through our schools over there. Through providing health care to mothers expecting their, unborn babies to be born into this difficult situation. All of that is an attempt at giving hope. And I think that's the key word there, providing hope to the hopeless.
And it's such a tough thing to do. Iris, let me bring you in. You work with girls and women, you run a hotline. Um, we haven't discussed gender yet in this discussion. Does that have a component in behavioral science and preventing radical extremism? And then also the internet is another thing we haven't discussed enough, which you use a fair bit. Talk to us.
Thank you so much. Actually, we work with women and girls, but we also work with men and boys because we see them as a important part of the discussion and an important part of the solution. Uh, so many years ago, we were working only on empowerment of women and girls, but then we realized that that's wrong because we have to educate young boys not committing violence, and we have to include fathers and other men that are an avant-garde in the society in order to have them as allies. Behavioral science is very important because it helps us on underlying the main factors and also to develop intervention strategies when working with different target groups that we're working. And the center that I'm leading has 30 years of experiences of helping women and girls. But we are working also with perpetrators, and we are working inside the prison and through the probation offices, because I think that everybody deserves a second chance, and people needs to have a different behavior role when you present them a different path. Because for most of the people that we're working with, what they have seen and what they have experienced in their life, it has been only violence. And you know that when you are raised in a violent home, when you are a grown up, you repeat the same violence. So, in 3 years ago, by having this long experience of having this national helpline, with the support of GSERT that I really want to thank, and also with Hedaya support, we opened an initiative that I think it's unique, an info call center on violent extremism in Albania. And the idea was to inform people that lack information, to help them, and also to counsel them. So we get a lot of questions and a lot of phone calls from school psychologists and teachers and professionals that are watching traits of violent extremism in some of the students. We are getting a lot of questions from family members when they see that a person of the family is being radicalized and they don't know what to do with him or her. We get phone calls from parents that they want to know and they are concerned about the impact of violent extremism that their children are having, and they need counseling, or when they see that their children or relatives are navigating in the sites with extremism contents. So we get a lot of phone calls and even from civil society activists that are working in the community. And this helped us to understand that you should, by knowing which are the underlying factors of those behaviors, they help a lot in order to identify even and develop even practical strategies on working with which target group. And coming to the next thing about the technology, I think that's a very important thing because we know that all this violent extremism that happens every day in the street, at home, at work, is amplified much more on the internet and the online world. Unfortunately, you could see a lot of people that goes in the dark internet, and they don't self-report when they see encrypted part of the violent extremism because they don't know that it is wrong. So that's why this is, I think, something that is very tangible, and it should be we should be talking a lot about that. One more thing before I leave the microphone to the others is that I see a problem with the lack of information on using the technology from the police side and from prosecutor and law enforcement agency. And we think that this is very, very important. It is important because in order to say to a police officer that this child in the school is navigating through this uh, extremism content, he needs first to use technology. He should know the importance of it, and then also to have the approach of helping and to know what to do as a law enforcement person to deal with that. So that's why I think that internet, we know it has been becoming very handy and reachable, but it has downsides to it, as it was said here earlier. So that's why I think that we should train law enforcement agencies, especially on the use of technology and how to use it by themselves, but also how to have it framed in a legal framework, because we know that to quantify a crime, you need to have a legislation in place.
Mm. Ambassador Grammager, sorry it's taken me a while to get to you. You've run the OSCE, you've been a diplomat for decades. When you hear all of these approaches and solutions and, from people who've worked in different arenas, come from different countries, um, does it strike you that the magnitude of so much of terrorism and thinking about terrorism is essentially whack-a-mole? But what we're discussing here is figuring out the root causes of problems and how to address them. But isn't that essentially then about money and economics and bigger problems that are just hard to tackle?
Well, let me first also express my gratitude to our Qatari hosts and to CT to invite me on this distinguished panel. Look, I think we are talking here about using insights of behavioral science for tackling preventing, combating violent extremism in a more effective way. And I think I would caution, behavior science is not a silver bullet that will kind of tell us all. It's not a cookbook, but at the same time, and in a way, it's basically applying research to policy making, which is evidence-based policy making, and that I think per se makes a lot of sense. Uh, it's and behavioral science is not contradicting these underlying facts that at the end, if you want to successfully counter prevent extremism, it's of course about giving youth perspectives, a future, hope. It's about development. It's about jobs. I think all that remains fundamental. But I do think that these insights help us in shaping, for instance, effective community engagement. In for instance, identifying early on radicalization patterns that we then can address. In figuring out who are the stakeholders that you need to deal with if you want to be effectively countering negative narratives, conspiracies, etc. And in turn, if you want to embark on developing counter narratives, and I think talking about social media, modern technology, I think it's very important, that also we, the good guys, use these technologies and don't leave it only to the bad guy. Meaning, that we work with influencers on social media. with, I don't know, influential religious figures, musicians, actors, etc., to promote positive narratives. So at the end, I think while kind of being aware that this is not a panacea, using insight of behavioral science, I think it can be extremely useful in designing effective approaches to prevent, encounter violence.
So let's actually take that and, Undersecretary General, I'll come to you with this question. How do we better integrate these approaches, behavioral science, into policy making and into policy design that could strengthen counterterrorism?
I think, again, we have a key word in this regard, prevention, because this is the most effective tool how to prevent, because you have objective picture of the state of mind of a person. We could know the sticking point when the process of radicalization is irreversible. Of course, it's very tricky exercise. Again, I need to emphasize the necessity not to be in contradiction with human rights, because it's a sensitive and delicate issue to use this kind of instrument. But if we are successful enough to find this point when a person is radicalized, starting to be dangerously radicalized, it could make our prevention efforts very effective.
Are you talking about big data and AI here?
Yes, yes.
And are you already using that?
We are doing this part of job with our Qataris colleagues, trying to introduce this kind of tools to law enforcement and security agencies to help to understand how to make prevention better. So it's very practical, but of course, we need to put more and more efforts to understand how to do this kind of work. We have Behavioral Insights Academy established here in Doha. It's a part of my office working with this topic. And they have a number of practical engagements, again, with the professional people in this field. They did organize a number of trainings in different parts of the world. So the process is going on, but to measure a real success of these activities, we need to have more data and we need to make more effort. But I think it's very important to keep eye on this part of our agenda, because again, this is the most direct way how to prevent better. But it's not going only about prevention. We have this issue of former terrorist fighters detained in a number of camps on the territory of Syria and Iraq. And the radicalization of these people is very challenging issue. Still, by the way, close to 70,000 people are detained, including women and children in this camp. And we need to find as fast solution as possible. And member states, unfortunately, are not very eager to have these people back. So behavioral science could be very helpful in this regard to understand is a person is de-radicalized definitely, and could be again a part of normal society.
Mm.
So I think there are a lot of different dimensions of this.
Fascinating. We are almost out of time. I promise to try and take a question from the audience. Any takers? Do I see any hands? I see two hands. Why don't we take both of your questions together? If a microphone can work its way down the aisle, there's a lady there in blue. I'll take yours. So very quickly and
Yeah.
ending with a question mark. please.
Rawa Ojay from Al Jazeera. From what I understood, and because I worked a little bit on UNOCT, you are working more on the camps. I've been in Mosul, and there are some people who left the camps. The government says that they're providing papers and so on, but there are hundreds of children without paper, no access to school, no access to employment later. And from what I saw, this is really a very fertile environment for radicalization. So is there any work done on people out of the camps with governments or to push governments to be more serious to tackle these issues.
Okay. And a very quick question behind you, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure listening to the panel. My name is Shabri Nair. I'm from the International Organization for Migration here in Qatar. This is to Dr. Khalid Koser, who has also been a very, very proficient migration expert during his time. I'm curious to know, the West constantly sees extremism also coming through a migration perspective. And I'm curious to know how you would help unpack that situation so as to avoid these kinds of conversations. Thank you.
Okay, Khalid, you can see the clock ticking, so you know what we're up against. Try and take that on.
Oh, well, it's not. Thank Shabri. It's very nice to see you. Look, let's be clear. I think you're right. There is a perception, a misperception in the West that we need to control our borders because we risk importing extremism. There is absolutely no empirical evidence whatsoever that migrants or asylum seekers or even irregular migrants are more prone to extremism than the natives among whom they are settling. And I would argue the strongest correlation between extremism and migration is that migration is generating extremist perspectives within our society.
Responsa. I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists for their expertise, their insight, and most of all, the work that they do every day. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to UNOCT and Doha Forum. Pleasure having you all. Onwards to the next session.